Don't get fingerprints on something you could never afford. The sentence cut through the Ferrari showroom so sharply that even the low hum of air conditioners seemed to disappear. For a second, nobody moved. The polished red Ferrari F40 sat under a circle of white lights, its glossy paint reflecting the ceiling like liquid fire. Every chrome detail gleamed. Every curve looked untouchable. And standing less than 3 feet away from it was Amara Johnson. Her fingers froze around the clipboard she had been carrying. The scent of fresh leather, motor oil, and expensive wax filled the air. Around her, several customers turned their heads. One man stopped mid-conversation. Another raised an eyebrow over the rim of a coffee cup. Nobody spoke. Ethan Caldwell stepped forward with the confident smile of someone who had spent years believing he belonged wherever he stood. His tailored gray jacket carried the Ferrari logo stitched above the pocket. The keys clipped to his belt jingled softly as he crossed his arms. "You heard me," he said. "These cars aren't toys." A few people chuckled. Not loudly. Just enough. Amara lowered her eyes for a moment. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. The reflection of the showroom lights shimmered across the marble floor beneath her sneakers. She could feel dozens of eyes measuring her without knowing a single thing about her. 22 years old. Black. Quiet. Wearing a simple work shirt with a temporary visitor badge attached to the collar. To most of them, that was all they saw. Not the engineering scholarship hanging on her apartment wall. Not the nights spent studying mechanical systems until 2 in the morning. Not the years she had spent rebuilding old engines with her father before cancer took him away. Ethan gestured toward the entrance. "The waiting area is over there." His voice remained polite enough for customers to hear, but sharp enough for its meaning to land. Employees and visitors should stay in designated sections. Another pause settled over the room. Amara nodded once. "I wasn't touching the car." "Good," Ethan replied. "Let's keep it that way." The laughter came a little easier this time. Amara's grip tightened slightly around the clipboard. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough for the paper edges to press into her palm. Through the giant showroom windows, afternoon sunlight spilled across rows of Ferraris parked outside. Red, yellow, black. Machines worth more than most houses. Machines she had loved since she was a little girl sitting on an overturned milk crate inside her father's repair shop. Back then, her father would spread greasy blueprints across a workbench and tell her stories about Italian engineering. He used to say every great machine had a voice if someone cared enough to listen. Amara remembered that now. She took one slow breath and started walking toward the waiting area. The showroom gradually returned to life behind her. Conversations resumed. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Salespeople smiled for wealthy clients. But before she reached the corner, something stopped her. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a person. It was a sound. Faint. Almost hidden beneath the noise of the building. Her head turned toward the F40. The engine had been started briefly for a customer demonstration. Most people would never notice anything unusual. Most people would hear power, performance, prestige. But Amara heard something else. A tiny irregular rhythm buried deep beneath the engine note. Her heartbeat slowed. Her eyes narrowed. And for the first time since Ethan's remark, she forgot about the humiliation entirely. Because the Ferrari was trying to tell a story, and she wasn't sure anyone else in the building could hear it. Amara remained standing near the edge of the waiting area, her attention fixed on the showroom floor behind the glass partition. The conversations around her faded into a distant blur. She heard fragments of laughter, the hiss of an espresso machine, the soft clicking of expensive shoes across polished marble, but none of it mattered. Her focus stayed on the Ferrari F40. A technician had opened the driver's door, while a wealthy customer circled the vehicle with obvious admiration. The engine idled for a few more seconds before being shut off. Silence followed, but the sound lingered in Amara's mind. She had heard enough engines in her life to know when something felt wrong. Not broken, not obvious. Wrong. The kind of problem that hid beneath confidence. The kind that waited patiently until the worst possible moment. She slowly opened the clipboard in her hands and flipped to a blank sheet of paper. Her pencil moved almost automatically. 3 short notes appeared. Fuel delivery fluctuation. Intermittent pressure inconsistency. Possible high-load failure. She stared at the words for several seconds. Then she frowned. The symptoms did not fit together perfectly. Something was missing. Across the showroom, Ethan was guiding a group of clients through a presentation. His smile had returned. His posture radiated certainty. Every gesture seemed carefully rehearsed. The customers followed him from car to car, while sunlight reflected across the glossy paintwork surrounding them. Nobody appeared concerned. Nobody appeared to hear what she had heard. Amara looked down again. Her father used to test her this way. He would start an engine and ask her to close her eyes. Not because he wanted her to memorize sounds, but because he wanted her to listen. Really listen. Back then she was barely 12 years old, sitting on a wooden stool inside a cramped garage that always smelled like oil and hot metal. While other children spent weekends at malls or movie theaters, she spent hers handing tools across workbenches and learning how machines communicated. Every rattle meant something. Every vibration carried a message. Every unusual sound had a cause. She could still hear her father's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her now. Machines tell the truth, sweetheart. People do not always want to hear it. The memory settled heavily in her chest. She swallowed and looked toward the F-40 again. A young sales associate climbed into the driver's seat to reposition the car for photographs. The engine started once more. There it was. Faint, brief, almost invisible beneath the roar of Italian engineering. A tiny hesitation. Less than a second. Most people would never notice it. Amara did. Her pulse quickened. She leaned forward slightly. The associate pressed. The accelerator. The engine responded. Powerful. Smooth. Impressive. Then the hesitation returned for the briefest instant. Her stomach tightened. This time she was certain. The problem existed. The question was how serious it might become. Nearby, two customers glanced toward her. One noticed the concentration on her face and followed her gaze toward the Ferrari. Then he simply shrugged and returned to his conversation. Nobody else seemed interested. Nobody else seemed concerned. The showroom lights reflected across the glass in front of her, creating ghost-like images that floated over the cars. Amara lowered her pencil and looked at the notes she had written. A decision waited in front of her. She could remain silent. After all, nobody here expected her opinion. Nobody here wanted her opinion. Or she could risk another humiliation and say something. Across the showroom floor, Ethan laughed at a joke from one of the clients. The sound echoed softly through the building. Amara folded the paper once and slipped it into her pocket. Then she took a slow breath and started walking back toward the Ferrari. Amara crossed the showroom floor slowly, feeling the cool marble beneath her shoes and the weight of every glance that followed her. The folded sheet of paper rested in her pocket like a stone. She could still hear the engine in her mind. Not the power, not the prestige, the flaw, the tiny inconsistency that refused to leave her alone. Ahead of her, the small crowd around the Ferrari was beginning to disperse. The wealthy customer who had come to inspect the car checked his watch while a photographer adjusted equipment near a display wall. Ethan stood nearby, speaking confidently about performance numbers, production history, and collector value. Everything looked perfect. That was the problem. The most dangerous problems usually did. Amara stopped several feet away and waited for a pause in the conversation. The smell of polished leather mixed with the faint scent of gasoline drifting from the service bay in the rear of the building. Her father used to say that machines never cared about appearances. Metal did not lie. Pressure did not lie. Heat did not lie. People did, especially when money was involved. Ethan noticed her first. His expression tightened almost immediately. Not anger. Annoyance. The kind reserved for inconveniences that refused to disappear. "Can I help you?" he asked. Several customers turned toward her again. Amara kept her voice calm. "I think there may be an issue with the car." The showroom grew noticeably quieter. Ethan blinked once, then smiled. "An issue?" I heard an irregular hesitation during throttle response. A brief silence followed. One customer exchanged a glance with another. Ethan let out a short laugh. "You heard that?" "Yes." "And what exactly qualifies you to diagnose a Ferrari from across a showroom?" The question landed exactly where he intended. A few people smiled awkwardly. Others looked away. Amara felt warmth rise in her face, but refused to lower her eyes. "I am studying mechanical engineering," she said, "and I grew up working around engines." Ethan folded his arms. "That is very impressive." His tone suggested the opposite. Fortunately, Ferrari-certified technicians already inspected the vehicle. More laughter. Softer this time. Amara reached into her pocket and unfolded the paper. The creases were still fresh. "I wrote down the symptoms. If someone could at least check fuel pressure under load conditions, it might be worth reviewing. Ethan did not even look at the page. Instead, he glanced toward the customer standing beside the car. This is exactly why amateurs should not jump to conclusions. The customer gave a polite nod, clearly uncomfortable. Amara stood still. Her fingers tightened around the paper. For a moment, she considered walking away. She considered letting the embarrassment settle and disappear like every other insult she had swallowed throughout her life. Then she remembered the countless nights in her father's garage. The smell of hot metal. The radio playing softly in the corner. His voice explaining that responsibility mattered more than pride. If you know something is wrong, sweetheart, say it. Even when nobody wants to hear it. Amara slowly extended the note toward Ethan one last time. Please, just have someone look. Ethan finally took the paper. For one brief second, she thought he might actually read it. Instead, he glanced at the folded sheet, smiled without warmth, and casually dropped it into a nearby trash bin. The paper disappeared beneath discarded coffee cups and advertising brochures. Around them, the showroom resumed its motion. Conversations restarted. Shoes clicked against marble. Cameras flashed. But Amara's eyes remained fixed on the trash bin. Because deep inside, beneath the humiliation and disappointment, one certainty remained stronger than ever. The Ferrari was trying to warn them, and nobody was listening. Amara did not move right away. The paper was gone now, buried beneath trash as if the warning had never existed. Around her, the showroom continued shining under perfect white light. Customers admired cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sales associates smiled. Cameras flashed. The building looked flawless from the outside. Ethan preferred it that way. Reputation was everything to him. For nearly 15 years, he had built his career around appearances. Every detail mattered. Every presentation. Every handshake. Every sale. The Ferrari garage was not simply a workplace in his mind. It was proof that he belonged among successful people. Proof that he had climbed above the small Ohio town where he grew up. Proof that he had escaped a life he never wanted to revisit. What Ethan never admitted was that insecurity still followed him. It hid beneath expensive suits and polished confidence. Whenever someone unexpected challenged his authority, the old fear surfaced. The fear that someone would discover he did not know everything. The fear that control could disappear. That was why he dismissed people so quickly. It was easier than listening. Easier than questioning himself. Across the showroom floor, Ethan returned to his conversation with a client, but his eyes drifted briefly toward Amara. She was still standing near the display area. Calm. Quiet. Not arguing. Something about that bothered him more than if she had raised her voice. Most people became defensive when embarrassed. Most people left. She simply watched. The wealthy customer beside him adjusted his watch and glanced toward the F40. Beautiful machine, the man said. Ethan immediately smiled. One of the finest examples in the country. The customer nodded. The owner must be excited. Ethan looked toward the car and straightened his jacket. Richard Sterling is arriving later this afternoon. The name carried weight. Even inside a room filled with wealthy people, Richard Sterling stood apart. Billionaire investor. Collector. Philanthropist. His private collection was legendary among automotive enthusiasts. The F40 was scheduled to appear at an exclusive event the following morning, attracting media attention from across the state. Everything needed to be perfect. That thought settled Ethan's nerves. Perfect. The inspections were complete. The paperwork was complete. The vehicle was ready. One uncertain comment from a visitor could not change that. Yet despite telling himself this, he found his attention drifting back toward the service bay doors. A faint uneasiness lingered. Not because he believed Amara, because he hated unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Amara quietly walked away from the showroom and toward the rear section of the building. The sounds changed immediately. The polished atmosphere faded behind her. Here the air smelled different. Oil, rubber, warm metal. Real work happened here. She paused beside a window overlooking the maintenance area. Technicians moved between lifts. Toolboxes rolled across concrete floors. Diagnostic screens glowed blue beneath fluorescent lights. For the first time all day, she felt comfortable. Machines made sense. People were harder. She folded her arms and stared through the glass. Somewhere inside that Ferrari, a problem existed. She was sure of it now. The certainty sat deep in her chest like a steady heartbeat. Outside, clouds drifted across the afternoon sun, briefly dimming the light that poured through the building's massive windows. The showroom grew slightly darker before brightening again. Nobody noticed the change. Nobody except Amara. Because at that exact moment, a black luxury sedan turned into the parking lot. And the man stepping out of the back seat would soon change everything. The black sedan rolled to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance. Its polished surface reflected the late afternoon sunlight like dark glass. A valet hurried forward, but the rear door had already opened. Richard Sterling stepped out with the calm confidence of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. He was dressed simply compared to the executives who often surrounded him. No flashy watch, no dramatic entrance, just a navy jacket, gray slacks, and the quiet presence that made people pay attention the moment he entered a room. Inside the showroom, word spread quickly. Sales associates straightened their posture. Conversations shifted. Ethan immediately moved toward the entrance with a practiced smile. This was the client everyone wanted to impress. The owner of the rare Ferrari sitting under the display lights. The man whose approval could influence careers. Richard entered the building and paused briefly beside the car. His eyes moved across the body panels, the wheels, the interior. Not admiring. Evaluating. Like someone inspecting an old friend. Ethan approached with his hand extended. "Mr. Sterling, it is great to see you again." Richard shook his hand politely. "How is she doing?" Ethan smiled. "Perfect condition. Fully inspected. Ready for tomorrow." Richard nodded, but said nothing. His attention remained on the vehicle. He slowly circled it once, fingertips resting lightly against the roofline. The showroom seemed quieter now. People watched without pretending otherwise. Meanwhile, Amara stood near the service area window. She could see the gathering from a distance. The sunlight had shifted lower, casting long reflections across the floor. She told herself to stay where she was. The warning had been dismissed. The decision was no longer hers. Yet the feeling remained. That same stubborn certainty. The same feeling she used to get when her father paused halfway through a repair because something did not add up. Her eyes drifted toward the trash bin near the display area. The folded note was still there, partially visible beneath a paper cup. A simple piece of paper carrying a warning nobody wanted. Back in the showroom, Richard stopped beside the driver's door. "Has anyone road tested it under sustained load?" he asked. Ethan answered immediately. Standard procedures were completed. Richard looked at him. "That is not what I asked." Ethan hesitated for half a second. "Not recently. The vehicle has spent most of its time in climate-controlled storage." Richard nodded slowly. His expression revealed nothing. Then he opened the door and settled into the driver's seat. The leather creaked softly. The familiar scent of aged Italian craftsmanship filled the cabin. He pressed the ignition button. The engine came alive instantly. Heads turned throughout the building. The deep mechanical growl echoed through glass and steel. Ethan smiled. Several customers smiled too. The sound was impressive, powerful, expensive. But from across the room, Amara felt her stomach tighten. There it was again. Brief. Almost invisible. A tiny interruption hidden beneath the roar. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. His hand remained on the steering wheel as he listened. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then the engine settled back into its smooth rhythm. Ethan continued smiling, unaware that for the first time all afternoon, Richard Sterling was no longer looking at the Ferrari. He was looking past it, toward the young woman standing alone near the service bay window. Richard let the engine idle a few seconds longer. The deep mechanical rhythm echoed softly through the showroom, bouncing off glass walls and polished floors. Most people heard perfection. He heard something else. Not enough to identify. Not enough to explain. Just enough to make him pay attention. He switched the engine off and stepped out of the car. Ethan immediately moved closer. "Everything sounds excellent," he said with confidence. Richard closed the driver's door gently. "Maybe." The single word hung in the air. Ethan's smile weakened slightly. Nearby employees exchanged quick glances before returning to work. Richard looked across the showroom again. Amara was still standing near the service bay window. She was not trying to attract attention. She was not speaking to anyone. She simply watched the car with the same focused expression she had worn all afternoon. Richard had spent decades building companies, investing in industries, and making decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. One lesson had followed him through every success and every mistake. The loudest person in the room was rarely the most observant. He turned toward Ethan. Who is she? Ethan followed his gaze. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Just a visitor. Richard nodded slowly. Just a visitor? Ethan forced a small laugh. Mechanical engineering student. Nothing official. Richard continued watching Amara. She looks concerned. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Earlier she claimed she heard a problem with the car. Richard looked back at him. Claimed, yes, based on listening from across the showroom. Richard remained silent. The quiet lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally he asked, and what did she think she heard? Ethan shrugged. Nothing supported by evidence. The answer arrived too quickly. Richard noticed. He always noticed. Across the room, sunlight continued slipping lower through the windows. Golden reflections stretched across the marble floor. The bright showroom now carried the warmer colors of late afternoon. Richard took a few steps toward the display area and stopped beside the trash bin near the vehicle. Something white caught his attention. A folded piece of paper partially hidden beneath a discarded coffee cup. Without saying a word, he reached down and pulled it free. Ethan immediately recognized it. A faint color drained from his face. Richard unfolded the paper carefully. 3 short notes stared back at him in neat handwriting. Fuel delivery fluctuation. Intermittent pressure inconsistency. Possible high-load failure. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just observations. Richard read the page twice. Then a third time. The paper felt unusually heavy in his hand. He looked toward Amara again. She seemed surprised that he was reading it at all. Ethan cleared his throat. Like I said, it is speculation. Richard folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Maybe. The same word again. Calm. Quiet. Unreadable. Then he started walking across the showroom floor. Conversations softened as people noticed his movement. Employees stepped aside. Customers watched curiously. Amara saw him approaching and instinctively straightened her posture. Her heartbeat quickened. Not from fear. From uncertainty. Richard stopped a few feet away. For a moment neither person spoke. The distant sound of tools echoed faintly from the service area beyond the glass wall. Finally Richard held out the folded paper. Did you write this? Amara nodded once. Yes, sir. Richard studied her face. Not searching for confidence. Searching for honesty. Tell me exactly what you heard. Start from the beginning. Across the showroom, Ethan stood completely still. For the first time all day, he realized the conversation was no longer under his control. Amara took a slow breath. The showroom suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. Conversations had not completely stopped, but they had faded into the background. The soft clink of coffee cups, the distant hum of air conditioning, the occasional footstep across marble floors, all seemed far away. Richard Sterling stood patiently in front of her, waiting. Not challenging, not mocking, simply listening. It was a rare thing. Amara looked at the Ferrari for a moment before answering. The first thing I noticed was a hesitation during throttle response. Richard nodded once. Go on. It is subtle. Most people would not hear it. Ethan shifted his weight across the room, but said nothing. Amara continued. The sound appears for less than a second. It disappears quickly. That is why it is easy to miss. Richard folded his hands. And what do you believe causes it? Amara glanced toward the car again. The bright red paint reflected the golden afternoon light streaming through the windows. I am not certain. She chose her words carefully. But if I had access to diagnostic equipment, I would start by checking fuel pressure consistency under heavy load conditions. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in skepticism. In concentration. Why fuel pressure? Amara paused. Images from years earlier drifted into her mind. Her father's garage. Old radios playing country music. The smell of warm engine. Blocks after long summer afternoons. Because I have heard something similar before. Richard waited. My father restored performance cars when I was growing up. One customer had a vehicle that sounded almost perfect. Almost. The problem only appeared when the engine demanded maximum delivery. Most inspections missed it because everything looked normal at idle. The memory felt vivid enough to touch. She could almost hear her father's voice explaining mechanical systems while wiping grease from his hands. Machines tell stories. Listen long enough, and they will tell you where they hurt. Richard looked down briefly, considering her words. Then he asked a question nobody expected. How long have you been studying engineering? 3 years. And you still trust your ears that much? A faint smile touched Amara's face. Sometimes ears notice what computers have not found yet. For the first time, Richard smiled as well. Small. Genuine. Across the showroom, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The conversation was becoming more serious than he had anticipated. He had expected Richard to dismiss her politely and move on. Instead, the billionaire kept asking questions. Worse, he seemed interested in the answers. A few nearby employees had stopped pretending not to listen. Richard turned toward the Ferrari again. The sunlight had shifted lower, casting long golden reflections across the bodywork. Dust particles floated through the beams of light like tiny sparks suspended in the air. Everything appeared calm. Yet something had changed. The room no longer felt certain. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded Amara's note one more time. His eyes moved across the handwriting. Fuel delivery fluctuation. Intermittent pressure inconsistency. Possible high-load failure. 3 simple observations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing designed to impress. Just concern. Honest concern. He folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked toward Ethan. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Finally, Richard spoke. I would like the vehicle inspected again. The showroom froze. Ethan blinked. Sir. Richard's expression remained calm. A complete diagnostic review. Before I drive it anywhere. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the distant service bay, where a wrench struck concrete and echoed faintly through the building. And standing near the service window, Amara felt something she had not felt all day. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Relief. Because for the first time since she heard the strange sound hidden inside the engine, someone had finally decided to listen. The atmosphere inside the showroom changed almost immediately. It was subtle at first. A shift in posture. A hesitation in conversation. The certainty that had filled the building all afternoon seemed to weaken around the edges. Richard Sterling's request was simple, but its effect was enormous. A second inspection meant doubt. Doubt meant questions. And questions were dangerous for people who preferred assumptions. Ethan forced a professional smile and nodded. Of course, sir. We can arrange another review. Richard looked at him for a moment. Not arrange one. Start one. The distinction landed heavily. Ethan's smile remained, but it felt tighter now. Right away. Within minutes, the Ferrari was carefully moved toward the service area. The polished showroom lights gave way to the cooler glow of fluorescent fixtures. Concrete replaced marble. The scent of leather faded beneath the smell of oil, rubber, and warm machinery. Technicians gathered around the vehicle as diagnostic equipment was rolled into position. Computer screens flickered to life. Cables were connected. Tool drawers opened and closed. The process had begun. Richard remained nearby, watching quietly. He did not hover. He did not interfere. He simply observed. That was what made people nervous. Across the room, Amara stood near a workbench, uncertain whether she should stay or leave. Nobody had invited her to participate. Nobody had asked for further advice. Yet nobody had asked her to leave either. The contradiction felt strange. Earlier that day, she had been treated like she did not belong. Now several technicians were stealing occasional glances in her direction. Not hostile. Curious. One of them, a gray-haired mechanic named Walter, finally approached her. His hands carried years of experience in every scar and crease. You heard something? He asked quietly. Amara nodded. I think so. Walter studied her face. You sound more certain than that. She glanced toward the Ferrari. I am certain something is there. I am not certain what. Walter smiled faintly. That is usually how real diagnostics work. The comment surprised her. It was the first supportive thing anyone had said all day. Across the service area, Ethan was speaking with another technician, though his attention kept drifting toward Richard. The billionaire remained calm. Patient. Waiting. Minutes passed. Then more. Diagnostic screens displayed streams of numbers and graphs. Fuel pressure readings. Sensor outputs. Performance data. Everything appeared normal. One technician checked the results twice. Another reviewed historical records. Nothing unusual appeared. Ethan slowly regained confidence. He crossed his arms and watched the process unfold. The longer the tests continued without revealing a problem, the more comfortable he became. Eventually, he looked toward Amara. Not openly mocking. Just confident enough to believe the situation was resolving itself. Amara felt it too. The uncertainty. What if she had been wrong? What if she had misheard the sound? The thought settled into her stomach like cold metal. She folded her arms and stared at the diagnostic monitor. Numbers scrolled continuously across the screen. Everything looked normal, almost too normal. Then her eyes caught something. A tiny fluctuation, barely visible, so brief it disappeared before she could fully process it. Her heartbeat quickened. She stepped closer to the monitor. Another fluctuation appeared, then vanished again. Tiny, irregular, easy to ignore. Exactly like the sound she had heard. Walter noticed her expression. "What is it?" he asked. Amara did not answer immediately. She was staring at the screen, watching, waiting, listening with her eyes now instead of her ears. And for the first time that afternoon, the machine had finally started telling its story. Walter stepped closer to the monitor. The fluorescent lights above reflected across the screen, washing the rows of data in pale blue. Around them, the service bay remained busy. Tools clicked. Air compressors hummed. Technicians moved between workstations carrying tablets and diagnostic equipment. Yet for Amara, the world seemed to narrow to a handful of numbers flickering across a display. There, the fluctuation appeared again. Tiny, brief, easy to dismiss. Walter leaned forward. "What are you seeing?" Amara pointed toward the graph. "That pressure drop." Walter squinted. "It is barely noticeable." "Exactly." Another technician joined them. Then another. Soon 3 sets of eyes were fixed on the screen. The graph remained steady for several seconds. Everything looked normal. Then the irregularity returned. A small dip, gone almost instantly. Walter's expression changed. The confidence in his posture softened into concentration. He reached for the keyboard and replayed the recorded data. Once, twice, 3 times. The same anomaly appeared every time. Tiny, consistent, real. Across the service bay, Ethan noticed the gathering around the monitor. He started walking toward them. His footsteps echoed softly across the concrete floor. "What is going on?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Walter continued reviewing the data. The room felt quieter now. Richard Sterling remained standing near the Ferrari, watching from a distance. His hands rested comfortably in his pockets. His expression remained unreadable. Walter finally looked up. "There is a fluctuation." Ethan frowned. "A fluctuation? Fuel pressure." Ethan stepped closer. "How significant?" Walter hesitated. "That is what we are trying to determine." Ethan folded his arms. "Could be sensor noise." The statement sounded confident, but even he seemed less certain than before. Amara remained silent. She knew enough not to celebrate. Machines could mislead people who rushed to conclusions. Her father had taught her that too. Diagnose first. Prove second. A young technician initiated a deeper scan. Additional data appeared across the screen. Pressure curves. Historical readings. Load simulations. More numbers flowed past. Several minutes passed in tense silence. Then something changed. The simulated load test pushed the system harder than the earlier inspection had. The graph responded immediately. A larger drop appeared. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, but impossible to ignore. Walter stared at the monitor. Well, nobody spoke. He replayed the sequence. The same result appeared. Again and again. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Run it one more time." They did. Same result. Another technician checked a separate data source. Then a third. Every reading pointed in the same direction. Richard slowly approached the group. The room seemed to part around him as he walked. He stopped beside the monitor and studied the graph. "What does it mean?" he asked calmly. Walter exhaled through his nose. "It means she was right." The words landed with surprising weight. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. The monitor continued glowing beneath the fluorescent lights while the evidence remained frozen on the screen. Amara felt her heartbeat in her chest. Not because she felt vindicated, because she suddenly understood how close the problem had come to being ignored. Richard looked from the monitor to Amara, then back to the graph. The golden evening light filtering through the high-service bay windows painted long shadows across the concrete floor. Somewhere in the distance, a tool drawer closed with a metallic click. The sound echoed through the silence. And for the first time all afternoon, nobody in the building was looking at the Ferrari. They were all looking at the young woman who had listened when nobody else did. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter's words settled over the service bay. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Diagnostic screens continued displaying data that no longer looked ordinary. The tiny fluctuation that had seemed insignificant an hour earlier now carried a different meaning. It was evidence. Richard Sterling remained focused on the monitor. His face revealed very little, but those who knew him understood something important. He was not a man who reacted quickly. He reacted carefully. That was often more powerful. Ethan stared at the graph. His arms remained folded, yet the confidence he had worn all afternoon seemed to be slipping away. Can it be repaired? Richard asked. Walter nodded. Most likely. We need to inspect the fuel delivery system directly. There may be a component beginning to fail under higher demand. Richard glanced toward the Ferrari. The vehicle sat beneath the service lights, silent now. A machine worth a fortune. A machine that had nearly left the building without anyone noticing the warning signs hidden beneath its polished surface. How long would that take? Richard asked. A few hours for a complete inspection, Walter replied. Possibly less if we find the source quickly. Richard nodded. Then do it. The decision came without hesitation. Across the room, several technicians immediately returned to work. Tool carts rolled across concrete. Protective covers were placed over body panels. The inspection deepened. Ethan watched the activity in silence. Every passing minute made the situation harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, Amara remained near the monitor. She felt strangely disconnected from the attention surrounding her. The satisfaction she expected never arrived. Instead, she felt something else. She kept thinking about how close everyone had come to overlooking the problem. If Richard had not asked questions, if Walter had not run additional tests, if the data had not been examined more closely, the warning would have disappeared along with the note in the trash bin. Richard eventually walked over and stopped beside her. You seem less excited than everyone else. Amara looked up. I'm just glad they found it. Richard studied her expression. Most people would be celebrating. She shook her head slightly. Being right is not the important part. Richard waited. The important part is that the car gets fixed. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the service bay filled the silence between them. Air tools, footsteps, metal against metal. Honest sounds. Working sounds. Richard smiled faintly. Your father taught you that? The question surprised her. She nodded. Yes, sir. Richard looked toward the technicians working around the vehicle. Sounds like he taught you well. Nearby, Walter suddenly straightened from the engine bay. His movement immediately caught everyone's attention. He called another technician over and pointed toward a component hidden deep within the fuel system. The second technician leaned in. Then a third. Their expressions changed almost instantly. Richard noticed. Ethan noticed too. The room seemed to hold its breath. Walter carefully removed the part and carried it toward the workbench beneath a bright inspection lamp. Tiny reflections danced across the metal surface. After several seconds, he looked up. His eyes moved first to Richard, then to Amara. We found it, he said quietly. The words echoed through the service bay. And judging by the expression on Walter's face, the problem was even more serious than anyone had expected. The service bay seemed to grow quieter as Walter placed the component beneath the inspection lamp. The bright white light revealed details that were impossible to see moments earlier. Everyone leaned closer. Technicians, managers, even Richard Sterling stepped forward. The small metal piece rested on the workbench like an answer nobody expected to find. Walter pointed carefully. There. The room followed his finger. A tiny defect ran along the surface, barely visible, easy to overlook during a routine inspection. Yet under heavy demand, it could interfere with fuel delivery exactly as the diagnostic data had suggested. Walter slowly shook his head. This did not happen overnight. One of the technicians adjusted his glasses and examined it more closely. How was this missed? Nobody answered. Ethan looked away first. The question lingered in the air longer than anyone wanted. Walter set the component down gently. The defect only becomes obvious when the system is pushed hard. Under normal conditions, everything appears fine. That is why the data looked clean until we increased the load simulation. Richard stood silently for several seconds. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across the polished concrete floor while technicians continued studying the evidence. Finally, he looked toward Amara. You heard this from the showroom. It was not a question. She nodded. I heard something that did not fit. Richard glanced back at the component. Most people would have ignored it. Amara lowered her eyes briefly. Most people know more than I do. Walter let out a short laugh. Not today. A few technicians smiled. The tension eased slightly. For the first time all afternoon, the atmosphere felt different. Not because a problem had been discovered, because honesty had replaced assumption. Ethan remained near the edge of the group. The conversations around him seemed distant now. Earlier, he had been the authority in the room, the person everyone trusted. Now he found himself replaying the afternoon again and again. The note, the warning, the confidence with which he had dismissed both. Richard eventually turned toward him. The billionaire's voice remained calm. That somehow made it harder. Did you read her note before throwing it away? The question landed gently. Ethan swallowed. No. Richard nodded once. No anger. No lecture. Somehow that felt worse. You should have. Silence followed. Ethan stared at the floor for a moment. The concrete suddenly seemed more interesting than meeting anyone's eyes. Across the room, the Ferrari sat partially disassembled beneath the service lights. Its flawless exterior no longer seemed important. Machines were honest. They did not care about status, assumptions, or first impressions. They only revealed the truth eventually. Richard looked at Amara again. What are your plans after graduation? The question caught her completely off guard. I am not sure yet. Richard smiled faintly. That is probably the most honest answer I have heard all day. A few people chuckled. The tension softened further. Walter returned to work while technicians prepared replacement components. The repair process had already begun. Through the high windows, the last golden light of evening slipped across the service bay floor. Long shadows stretched between toolboxes and workstations. The day was ending. Yet for Amara, it felt as though something entirely different was beginning. Because standing among experienced mechanics, engineers, and one of the most successful businessmen in the country, she was no longer being treated like someone who did not belong. She was being treated like someone whose voice mattered. The repair was completed just before sunset. Fresh components had been installed. Every connection had been tested. Every pressure reading had been verified. The service bay carried a different energy now. Not tense. Focused. The kind of quiet that follows when uncertainty finally gives way to facts. Walter wiped his hands with a clean shop towel and stepped back from the vehicle. Run it again, he said. One of the technicians entered the driver's seat and pressed the ignition button. The engine came alive instantly. A deep mechanical growl filled the room. Everyone listened. Richard listened. Walter listened. Even Ethan stood perfectly still. The sound rolled through the service bay, smooth and steady. No hesitation. No interruption. No hidden irregular rhythm buried beneath the power. The engine sounded exactly as it should. Walter nodded slowly. That is the difference. A few technicians exchanged satisfied smiles. Richard remained silent for a moment, listening to the machine settle into a flawless idle. Then he turned the engine off. The sudden quiet felt almost symbolic. Something had been repaired that day. More than a car. Richard stepped out and walked toward Amara. The fading sunlight streaming through the high windows painted the floor in shades of gold and amber. Dust drifted through the light like tiny sparks. The service bay looked less like a workplace and more like a memory. Richard stopped in front of her. You know, he said, I have spent most of my life around experts. Amara looked uncertain how to respond. Richard smiled faintly. The good ones all share the same habit. They pay attention to details everyone else ignores. The words settled gently between them. Nearby, Walter nodded in agreement. Ethan remained several yards away, listening. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card. The card was simple, white, unremarkable, yet everyone in the room knew what it represented. He handed it to Amara. I would like you to call my office after graduation. Amara blinked. Sir, I fund engineering fellowships and research programs. People spend years sending applications hoping for an opportunity. He glanced briefly toward the repaired vehicle. You earned an interview by listening. The room fell silent again. Not with tension, with surprise. Amara looked down at the card resting in her hand. The paper felt impossibly light. Richard continued. Talent matters. Education matters. But curiosity matters too. You had all three today. Across the service bay, Ethan lowered his eyes. The memory of the discarded note seemed heavier with every passing minute. Eventually, he stepped forward. His movements lacked the confidence they once carried. He stopped several feet from Amara. For a moment, he struggled to find words. Then he spoke quietly. I should have listened. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed to ease the discomfort. Ethan took a breath. I judged you before I knew anything about you. The honesty surprised even him. Amara studied his face. The arrogance from earlier had disappeared. What remained looked more human, more uncertain. She nodded once, not triumphantly, simply accepting what had been said. Through the windows, the final rays of sunlight slipped lower beyond the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the concrete floor. The Ferrari stood repaired beneath the service lights. The problem was gone. The lesson remained. And somewhere deep inside Ethan Caldwell, a truth had finally become impossible to ignore. The service bay gradually emptied as evening settled over the building. Toolboxes were closed. Diagnostic screens went dark one by one. Conversations softened into distant murmurs before disappearing altogether. Outside, the sky above the parking lot had turned deep blue, with the last traces of sunlight fading beyond the horizon. The Ferrari remained beneath the service lights, restored and ready, its red paint reflecting the quiet glow overhead. Amara stood alone near the large service bay doors for a moment, holding Richard Sterling's business card between her fingers. The card felt almost unreal, not because of what it promised, but because of everything that had happened to place it there. Just hours earlier, she had been standing in the showroom feeling invisible, judged before she spoke, dismissed before anyone listened. Now the same building felt different, not because it had changed, because the people inside it had. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned and found Walter carrying his worn canvas jacket over one shoulder. Heading home, he asked. Amara smiled. Eventually, Walter nodded toward the Ferrari. Your father would have been proud today. The words landed softly. For a second, she could not answer. She simply looked at the floor, blinking away the sudden warmth behind her eyes. Walter gave a small nod, as if he understood without needing a response. Then he headed toward the exit. A few minutes later, Richard emerged from his office area carrying a set of keys. He paused beside the repaired vehicle and glanced toward Amara. One last thing, he said. She walked over. Richard looked at the Ferrari for a moment before speaking. Do you know what almost cost me today? Amara shook her head. Not the defective part. He rested a hand lightly on the roof of the car. The assumption that expertise always looks a certain way. The service bay fell quiet again. Richard smiled faintly. I have made enough mistakes in business to recognize that one. Amara looked down at the business card in her hand. Richard continued. The people who change industries are rarely the ones everyone expects. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard opened the driver's door and settled into the seat. The engine started. This time the sound was flawless. Smooth. Confident. Complete. The faint hesitation was gone. The hidden warning had become a solved problem. Richard lowered the window before pulling away. Do not stop listening, he said. Most people never learn how. Then he drove slowly out of the service bay and disappeared into the evening. The red taillights faded beyond the parking lot entrance. Silence returned. Amara stood there watching until the road beyond the building was empty again. The cool night air drifted through the open bay doors, carrying the scent of rain somewhere far away. She slipped the business card carefully into her pocket and started walking toward the exit. As she passed through the showroom, the marble floors reflected the last remaining lights. The same showroom where she had been told she did not belong. The same showroom where a folded warning had been thrown into the trash. She paused briefly near the display area. Then she smiled to herself and continued walking. Not because she had proven anyone wrong. Not because a billionaire had noticed her. But because her father had been right all along. Machines tell the truth. Sometimes people do too. They just need to be willing to listen. The lights behind her dimmed one section at a time as she stepped into the night. And without looking back, Amara Johnson walked forward into a future that finally seemed ready to hear her voice.